Tuesday afternoon. It's 4 p.m. in Central Europe, and it's time for our Space Café 33 Minutes with Pierre Lionnet, the space economist that challenges the new space narrative and predicted the space specs debacle. As always, we appreciate your participation and ongoing feedback, and we will learn and improve based on your feedback. I'm Torsten, publisher of SpaceWatch.Global, a Europe-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. And I would like to thank all our private and corporate supporters 2023 that showed their continued commitment to keep our independent journalism alive. We really appreciate that. And I know many of you are already familiar with our website, the bi-weekly and the daily newsletters, and the Space Café podcast. The latest one, published a few hours ago, features Markus Moslechner's conversation with Mitch Goldberg about outer space, 100 poems. A very unique episode for us, so please let us know your thoughts. We also have new exciting episodes of the Space Café Radio. The latest ones are with Dr. Timo Stuffler of OHB and Andreas Lindenthal of Airbus, two ELA specials. And we have a new podcast series for you, as you can see here on the slide. You asked for it, you got it. The Space Economy Insights podcast, hosted by Kevin O'Connell and our Dr. Emma Gatti. Their first guest was Claire Joly of OECD. So about the foundation of the space economy. Our fan shop is open for you because it's always open. It's on our website. So it's just a click away to become a real space watcher. If you have missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our website in the event section, and you can also find us on YouTube. So, my guest today is one of the most outspoken space economists, someone that questions the numbers, and he is very vocal on that. I'm very honored, truly honored, that he followed our invitation. So welcome to our Space Café, Pierre Lionnet. Pierre, for those that does not know him, is an economist with over 25 years of experience in the space sector. He is a well-known expert of space markets and technology trends. In his younger years, I like this phrase, he had a brief professional experience in venture capital, consulting, marketing, and worked for ESA as a research contractor before he was joining Eurospace in 1994 as a research and market analyst. And at Eurospace, he is now the research and managing director of this association. And he is a fellow ISU alumni. Pierre is tweeting on space economics and market on Twitter with his hashtag @LionnetPierre. Eurospace is the largest and most representative trade organization of the European space industry. Once more, welcome, Pierre, to our show today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, Torsten.
So tomorrow, 1st of March, or as our friend stated, 1/6 of the year, one bottle of the six-pack of the year is gone. Tomorrow I will have the chance to co-host with Peggy Hollinger from FT and FT Live panel with Carissa Christens of Brightech and Geraldine Najjar of ESA about the long-term sustainability of space invests. And Brightech came out with recent numbers of the global space market, $400-something billion. On our way to the $1 trillion industry in whatever time frame we want to hear now, 2030, 2040. So is it a bull or a bear? Let's talk about this $1 trillion economy. Are we now riding the wave? Can you help us to understand these numbers, these huge numbers?
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I think I can humbly, or maybe not so humbly, provides some insight on those figures. Actually, those figures have been floating around the sector for more than 20 years now. I've been an avid reader of the reports issued by the Tory Group originally for the SIA. in the past, which actually produced this interesting and I would say consistently done methodological approach to assess the space markets. And what is interesting is to look at what are those figures. My problem with this 400 billion or so amount is that it is at the same time incomplete and I believe unrelated to the space business in some dimension. In this global amount, basically you have 100 billion or so, which is relevant to government spending and which is put on the side. And this is fully relevant because the government spending in space is actually the #1 fuel that is energizing a sector. It is because the government are investing in space that we are able to build launchers, satellites, and so on. And in the past, they have been the main driving force, and I believe that governments will remain with their programs the main driving force for the people who are building satellites and launchers. But there are other things in the figure which I believe are slightly unrelated. And one big element of that figure is the totality of the ground segment. This is about 100 billion or so, so another 25% of the total. And this ground segment is completely relevant to the space activities. But when I see in the recent IPOs that we have seen, for companies such as Momentous or Virgin Galactic showing this total figure as a total addressable market, well, I was a bit put off because, I mean, the part which is relevant to building the chipsets that we have in our phones or the direct-to-home antennas to get TV, from satellite are completely unrelated to the fact that we are building launchers or satellites. And since most of the activities which are provided by the satellite are actually broadcast, you have a situation where you put in space an infrastructure which is giving you a capacity to broadcast a signal, and then the number of terminals which are connected to that are unrelated to the quantity of satellites you put in orbit. There is not a scaling factor. It's not because you have more people connecting to the broadcast that you will have more satellites in orbit. The GPS or the GNSS is a very basic example of that. You have 28 satellites in Galileo. They're enough to provide the signal and a solid infrastructure. And then you could have one terminal or 10 million or 8 billion terminals. All can consume the signal at the same time, and it doesn't make any difference. So for me, the point with this figure is that it is being used without discrimination. And so maybe I'm building a satellite, so I should really look at the part of the segment of the portion of the figure which is relevant to me. And if people were really focusing on that figure as a main driver for investment, we would see most of the investment in space looking at the ground segment, because this is where most of the money seems to be. Another part of the figure is related to the TV activities, so multimedia content distribution via satellite. And that's another figure which disturbs me. First, because the value of the programming, which is what is actually included in this figure, again, is not driving the need for satellites. And also this figure is incomplete because they only count the pay TV. And basically more than half of the TV distributed by satellite is free to air. It's paid for by advertising. So I think this figure should be bigger. But then again, if tomorrow the FIFA is negotiating at a higher price the cost of broadcasting the football cup, then this value would grow, and this is unrelated to the business of satellite. If tomorrow a FIFA World Cup becomes free, then the value of the content distributed reduces, and again, it doesn't change the need of satellites. So for me, the point with the figure is that at the beginning, people have been misusing it because probably they didn't look at the fundamental drives behind it. And then there is the growth factor. Do we get to 1 trillion? So this is the approach that was promoted by, it was Morgan Stanley, if I'm not wrong, in 2016 and 17. But if you look at the figure for Morgan Stanley, basically they project a 2 to 3% growth of every element in that figure. But then they add a layer on top, which they call the second order impact. And this is what eventually makes the figure double up by 2040. And this second order impact is not described anywhere. So basically they had the linear growth, which is, with inflation and normal business, something which everybody can relate to. And they turn it into an exponential figure, which gives a lot more excitation, of course, but nobody can explain why it is exponential. So this is why, I'm looking at the nifty details because as an economist, I'm trained for that. And whenever they give me a sum, I want to look at the details, otherwise I don't like the sum, you know. And going with me at the restaurant is horrible because I'm verifying everything at the end on the tab. So that's my main drive. But this is what is happening with this figure. So people have been looking at this nice exponential and using it to justify that space is growing. Space is growing, but probably not that way, and probably not in association with the fundamentals that people relate to in that figure. I believe that space is growing because there's more interest from public programs in space, and space is growing because, and this is, I believe, something you want to discuss later on,
Absolutely.
there is also commercial opportunities.
That's right, that's right. I mean, in our pre-talk, you mentioned these 110 billion today for this market, and you said 40% are US markets, 30 to 35 China. So there's not much left for Europe. And also, can you give us an estimate how many people at the end of the day are working in the space sector?
Absolutely, we can talk about that. So first about the money, and today the main players, if you look at the volume of activity in space, clearly are the USA and China. And 10 years ago, it was the USA and Russia. And 40 years ago, it was the USA and the USSR. So we have seen there's been a shift. You know, I like to explain that China is the new USSR in space. They're catching up and really building up. And now we have a new moon race. So it looks like we are, you know, reproducing the past with only China instead of the USSR. And clearly, those two major powers today are responsible for putting about 80 to 85% of the total capacity in orbit, which is a huge amount. So China, unfortunately, from the budget perspective, is not very transparent. So we don't know how much money China is really investing in space. But again, money is not the key point. For me, the point is assessing the capacity. So I'm comparing points. On the other hand, the USA is a very transparent system. So we have a lot of information on, particularly on the NASA budget, and a lot of disclosure through the US Senate on the DoD budget associated to space, including the NRO, etc. So the current estimate is that in the USA, the investment in space infrastructure is in the order of $50 billion a year. And with this, they are putting in orbit about 60 tons worth of spacecraft. And the Chinese, last year, they put in orbit about 105 tons of spacecraft, so a bit more than the Americans. And my take as an economist is that since those are very similar technological systems, I believe that from the point of money spent, it can be comparable. So I would say that, you know, the US is 50 billion, probably China is in the order of the same amount. And then what we have left, we have the European budget, which is in the order of 10 billion a year. So you see 50 USA, Europe 10. That's sizable, but compared to the US, it's much less. And then we have some from Japan, some from India, and then we have all those very small space powers, which are interesting to look at from a geopolitical perspective. But from the economist point of view, you know, in French, we say it's the thickness of the line. So that doesn't really make a big difference. So yes, I believe that making a sensible assessment, saying that the total sum of government spending in space is in the order of 100 to maybe $120 billion in a given year is a sensible and reasonable assessment. And Europe there is 10 billion, so about 1/10. So you see, Europe is not that big. And my take on that is also that if you look at other types of statistics, such as the one produced by the US Bureau of Economic Analysis, stuff you can find also from the Space Report. Things also I heard from personal conversation. I had a very interesting day with the people from the Chinese Space Agency sharing figure on industry and those kind of things. I came to the conclusion that the total people in the world which are associated to the activity of building and developing space infrastructure, so the satellites, the professional ground segment, and the launchers, of course, that needed to put those in space, would be in the order of maybe 800,000, 900,000, maybe 1 million workers worldwide. On top of that, you would have the people from the agencies. You know that NASA is 15,000 people. The Space Force, I saw the figure recently, it's a couple thousands already, plus the people in the US Air Force. So the people in the agencies are probably a fraction of all that. I would say maybe 15% on top, or maybe even 20% on top. In Europe, ESA is 2,500 people, CNES is about the same amount. So you see, those basically, I would say, are the global rules of thumb figures you can have. So 1 million people working in the space infrastructure business, and about $100 billion to $120 billion. That's the total value of the government spending.
Can we go back to the matrix and the indicators to assess these numbers, to help also our audience to make their own thoughts? Because that's one of the goals here, to not just give a lecture, also inspire others to question things. So, and here on these numbers, one of the points I have the feeling is that we are fooling ourselves in making everything space today. Yeah, you have the super cool screw, and then it's next day it's a space screw, yeah, or whatever, a fan, suddenly it's a space fan, and so on and so forth. And I said it with all the respect for the market that I love, but are we fooling ourselves with that, not staying on the track?
I think that one of the key features behind that is the fact that the main drive for space is public money. And there has been a major change of political thinking in recent years. Actually, not so recent anymore. I tend to believe that my youth is a recent year, which is not the case anymore. And but we have seen an evolution. Until the 80s and the 90s, there was a general Keynesian approach to government and policy. So basically, people were into a situation where you could invest public money without needing to justify a kind of return on investment on the public money, because you would have a public program such as, the health system in France, or the road system in Germany or in the USA. So nobody had to justify where you put money and invest in roads, or public lighting or water distribution. Space was part of that. We would do space because of science. We would do space because of tactical and strategic concerns and geopolitical concerns. And then we do space because there is some kind of massive dream behind it. When you think about the moon landings, the dreamscape dimension is absolutely essential. But with the 80s, the liberal economy, took place, and you saw Reagan, for instance, moving to the Commercial Space Act, and basically there was a need to translate public investment into something that looks like private investment with return on investment. And this has changed the approach. And I believe that the reason why everything has become space is because there was a need for politicians and lobbyists to justify this investment in space. And so showing that space was useful and creating the awareness on the usefulness of space. And it's a very different thing to say, when I am connecting my TomTom to the GNSS system, which enables me to navigate, I am making good use of space systems. And this is absolutely essential, and nobody's criticizing this. On the other hand, is TomTom a space business? I think it's not. It is using the GNSS signal because it's there. And it is also using a mapping system, which may use satellite data because it's there, but it's also using software, which they have developed. They also design, touch screen and then an enclosure. But eventually, TomTom is not a space business. Uber is not a space business. And they use the space systems like many other applications. But in the end, the fact that we have more people buying TomToms doesn't create the need for more satellite infrastructure. And there I am getting back to the market analysis. The usefulness of space and the lobbying points of showing that space is everywhere are actually very true. Nobody can say that space is not everywhere in what we are doing. Even the necessary communication from our cell phones is actually using correct localization to compensate for this Doppler signal, okay? So when you're moving, you need space just to make a call on your mobile. But on the other hand, when you look at market potential, when you are creating a business, you must not be fooled. You need causal links. You need to find those applications that will drive your revenue and growth. And again, I want to insist on the point that one global GPS system would be enough for humanity. The fact that we have Galileo, GPS, GLONASS, Beidou, and the Japanese was the QZ, okay, is actually a fact that nobody can really trust the others. So we are duplicating this infrastructure. But one would be enough to serve the whole world if we were in that kind of mindset, like like the Isaac Asimov approach of one Earth and, one Earth government, we would have only one GPS, and it would be maybe 32 satellites plus a few spare, and that would be enough. Today, we have more than 150 GNSS satellites that just duplicating the capacity, but it's not the need. And the market using those could grow indefinitely without growing this infrastructure. So if I'm building space clocks, my market, whatever the number of GPS devices, whatever the number of receivers we have, will still be producing 32 clocks that fly in space, and then the next generation, and the next after that. So looking at an inflated figure of additional terminals using space doesn't create a business case of growth for me. It's still only 32 clocks that are needed, or 28 or 27.
How do you see autonomous driving in that rationale? Is that car manufacturers then turning into autonomous mobile or mobility providers? Is that part of the space ecosystem then at the end? Because it needs more than just a GPS signal. It needs more than, So, but is it just in,
You're touching to the other area of development of space, the one which is more tense from the economic point of view. Today, when I talk about the GNSS, or when we talk about TV broadcast, it's a broadcast. So it's one single signal that everybody can use. It's a typical public service approach where, or like, the light tower, so that everybody can see the light, and I can use the signal without impeaching anyone else to use the same signal. And so this is a typical, the economic example of a public good. When you look at connected cars, when you look at mobile communications, when you look at a broadband internet service, this is a different thing, because you need to provide a tranche of capacity to every user. And here we have a different approach, because in that context, whatever type of service, which is a connected car or internet broadband, if you want to grow your market, you must grow your capacity in orbit accordingly. So at some point in time, you conceive a business, you deploy a satellite infrastructure, and then you try to attract sufficient customers to make it work. But as we see with Starlink, sometimes you're too successful, and in some areas, it's congested, and the quality of service goes down, and you need to deploy more infrastructure. So here we're touching at the other domain of space, which is one signal for one user. The car industry may be using a lot of connected solutions. A satellite is probably one that the car industry is considering, because normal people spend most of the time, I would say, in an urban populated area with good Wi-Fi, 4G, 3G, and whatever. Cars, differently, they have stretches of usefulness, which are probably in more isolated areas. So the satellite solution could provide the connectivity gap to actually ensure that cars will remain connected all the time. And at a personal basis, I still fail to see how this can be a bonanza for space, because I think it's a long way, because we need to find a lot of adoption for the car industry already, because they will need to invest, they will need to put all the terminals on the car, so they will need to select protocols and so on. I also see a hurdle with the regulators. Those self-driving cars and, automatic driving system. When we look at what Waymo is doing on one hand, so completely mapping before putting the car on the road. So Waymo basically is like a train. It knows where it's going, and then it only needs to adapt to the traffic autonomously. And what Tesla is doing with the autopilot solution, which is a way where the car is actually intelligently driving itself in every condition and discovering the road as it comes. So I believe it's a long way. I know that there are quite a few projects, including in Europe, which are really considering this. I know that the car industry is already vested in space. So I think that the next years would see, from the technology point of view, how this plays out. Today, I don't see this as a major opportunity yet. Not yet, because of maturity, regulatory, and technology.
But we see, and we had Markus Fritz in one of our previous talks, we see that they're coming together, the car industry, or even the mobility mobile provider, coming together with space. T-Mobile just made a big announcement at the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, I think yesterday or the day before. So it's coming together. It's it becoming to be part of everything else. My simple question, taking all these rationales you provided into account, is the space industry still growing?
I think yes, but I think that there is a major hurdle on what you call exactly the growth. And this is an exercise I've been doing. If you take the growth of space budgets, so the institutional part, this is easy. You can measure it when the information is available, and it's just euro piling over euro, and there is a growth trend in Europe. We see also it in the USA because the public interest in space remains strong and the strategic dimension is indeed strong. But then we have the commercial system. And here I'm really differentiating the two main business cases of satellites. The broadcast type, where, again, as I said, I believe it's an easier business case because you have one infrastructure and then it's dimensioned. And you must grow your customer base until you break even, and then you can keep growing the customer base without increasing capex, and then you make profit. On the other hand, you have the allocated bandwidth type of business, such as the connected cars, the mobile communications business, where you need to make sure that every user has a connected experience with a guaranteed bandwidth and service. And here I believe the key point is the overall capex investment over the usable lifetime of the satellites and based on the value of the service you can sell. If you take the example of Starlink, which is today the best in class in this kind of business model, they announced the lowest prices for the infrastructure worldwide, one order of magnitude below everyone else. As an economist, I still fail to believe, I have a kind of a problem because I have a discontinuity in my mind with the prices that we hear for the Starlink system and the prices we see from the other ones. But for those, I believe that the business is growing in numbers. More satellites are launched, and we see that Starlink satellites are really, populating the orbit now, the #1 launch power in the world. But the business value is not necessarily growing. The value of the satellites must remain small. Otherwise, the business case doesn't break even at the price where you can sell the capacity. If you take the price Starlink is selling its capacity, which is now $120, $130 per month for internet access, it's 4 or 5 times what you get from local fiber or ADSL. So it's an expensive service. And it's the first one that seems to be able to break even, but it's still much more expensive than everything else, which means that in the end, it will only be able to get to the market for this kind of service where the market is not serving customers with other solutions. But then think about if the Starlink infrastructure was 10 times more expensive, it would never break even. So my take on that is that if you want to have a commercial business grow, and if it is not a broadcast type of business in space, then you must make sure that your infrastructure is dead cheap. But if it is dead cheap, then there is no reason for the value of the market to grow. So you will be build more and more and more satellites, but since they are much cheaper, eventually the market could be reduced in value. And this is what is happening with a lot of consumer items, which the volumes have been growing, but not as fast as the price reduction, so that we see that today some appliances market are actually more in volume than they were 10 years before, but the market value is much cheaper. And I mean, if you look at the value of PCs, it's exactly it. You see, so there is this misconception, of course, that commercial space can grow in volume, provided that there is a significant reduction in price, which means that in value, it may not grow. And this is, I believe, what people are missing today sometimes.
I don't want to touch today on moon economy and that area, because that's something I feel we should have a separate discussion about. I would like to see, and you mentioned it just with the Starlink example, and we had examples in Europe with Astra to Connect, with Eutelsat's two-way, and I mean, I'm from this generation that even brought them out. So with Starship, Starlink, with the China activities, is Europe's answer sufficient if we want to call the answer IRIS-2?
So yes and no. I think that the European position in space has always been very peculiar. It's a smart follower. We don't have the means to lead the game. And historically, it took some time before the European countries managed to find a way of working together to achieve a critical mass that enabled them to produce the Ariane launcher, which was the gateway to European autonomous access to space, and probably also the justification for a lot of other investment into space programs. But the European Space Agency, plus the national agencies that work on the side, with their own special projects, it's a pretty unique thing because it addresses every single point of space activity. I think it's one of the few in the world which is like this. NASA is very different, for instance, because NASA has one main point investing in exploration activities, and then it's doing a lot in science. But if you look at telecommunications or Earth observation in operational program, it is not doing this. This is something which is more done by the military on the side in the USA. So in Europe, we have a very civilian agency with a globally a limited budget, and which is trying to make the best of every opportunity which is opened by the others. But some investment are just beyond the capacity of Europe and beyond the political construction of Europe. In the USA, you can have a president that says boots on the moon. And then, the cabinet is working and the agency is making proposals. In Europe, you can have a DG that says moon village. And he's a DG, it says moon village. And then nothing gets in the works. So we have a complex political construction in Europe where basically more justification is required to take the smart decisions. Eventually, and maybe I'm too biased because, I'm working for Eurospace and I've been doing advocacy for space programs in Europe for almost the past 30 years. But I think that the European recipe is quite unique and it is working well. Today, the IRIS-2 project is really some kind of response to avoid getting overwhelmed by stuff which is going beyond our control. And I believe that it makes sense to find a kind of European alternative to the Starlink system, which may become also a tool for the US government. There is, should not be forgotten, the JW initiative of the Chinese, which is basically Starlink, but made in China, so probably well made and much less expensive, even less expensive than Starlink. So Europe cannot be left behind. I think that IRIS Square is a good answer. It will be a complex project. I don't want to get into the number of political difficulties that we see ahead, to make this happen. We have seen the difficulties in the PPP for the Galileo proposal in 97, 98. It was really very complex to build. So, but I believe it's an opportunity that must be taken. Probably we will see the program being rescoped a little bit so that we define better the mission and what we are doing. But I think that having autonomous, full in control of the Europeans, capacity to make secure communications for whatever needs we have, the military, the Secret Service, our governments, that makes sense. It's still a bit expensive for what it is, I guess. And then we know that Europe would have a hard time finding the money and justifying all this.
As we have just a 33-minute session here, and I know that our production team will come after us in a bit here, we have to speed up a bit. Are these global trends that you mentioned, that you pointed, by far economically or sustainability? And if yes, I'm quite sure there will be certain conditions apply.
Yeah, I've been looking very closely at the amount invested in new space companies so far. I believe there will be a lot of consolidation happening. We see already that the rate of creation of entities is slowing down very significantly, and I believe there is too much money. I would like to give you one figure, just as an example. Today, if I look at my list of all the companies I have, which are proposing to make electric propulsion systems. So this has been one of the El Dorado thematics of space in the past few years. I could accumulate about 1,500 people working in those companies and hundreds of millions raised. Today, we recently saw in the press that Buzek, which is the leader for small propulsion, commercial propulsion system in the USA, just signed for the OneWeb constellation. And Buzek is a company of 60 people. And in order to fulfill the OneWeb order, they hired 15 more. So it will be 75 people. So we have the leader, you know, in Europe, the electric propulsion division of Safran, which is one of the leading entities for that in Europe, is less than 50 people. But we have 1,500 people working in new companies aiming to deliver electric propulsion systems to the commercial space market in the future. That's obviously too much. Even if it scales up, even if we multiply by 10 the number of satellites we launch, we still have at least 3 to 4 times overcapacity boiling and breathing down in these new companies which have been created in the past years. So this is an area of concern to me. Lots of overcapacity is boiling.
As we heard earlier, ASD-Eurospace is representing the European industry. So you have an eye on that, or especially, I'm quite sure. How is the European industry faring in this new space of challenges and opportunities? Do we have a chance? I mean, you mentioned the propulsion, small propulsion systems. You have Trust Me, you have Aurora, and God knows. I mean, there are, I think, a dozen of companies also in Europe that want to claim this market.
I think that first, I think that Europe is not really lagging behind. If we look at the number of companies we have created in Europe, there are really a lot compared to the size of the sector already. I think that Europe is even one step ahead of the US in proportion. I mean, the people in the new space industry, they represent about 5,000 people, new workers, new companies and new workers in the past 5 years. So that's a lot. It's 10% growth just by the powers of VCs investing in new ventures. So it's really growing fast. On the other hand, again, some can be very good. I don't want to make names because then I will offend the people which I didn't quote. But I have met a lot of companies which I believe have very solid engineering views. Actually, yes, I can mention one name because it's a not well-known company, but a company like Euroheat Pipes is seeing and proposing solution to actually grow and scale up the business significantly. They participated to a recent Eurospace workshop, and they actually showed the challenges of scaling up. But they recognize that one of the challenges of scaling up is also to address market price reduction. And again, they said, we are scaling up, we are automating, and we hope to get a larger volume, but we don't expect to grow our turnover by a factor 10. We think that it will be a scale of growth. And I believe that this is what people should really accept, is that there is no transformational moment right now, today, for the companies, meaning that because they get 100 million funding from a VC, tomorrow they will be able to scale up to 100 times the revenue they have today. I think that the scale up will be more moderate. I think that the oversupply will put a higher pressure on prices than we have already now, which will lead to a very difficult situations for many companies to stay afloat. So I'm a bit of a pessimistic sometimes, and I have seen, the first wave of the new space, like the way I like to call it, in the 90s with the Global Star Iridium, Teledesic, Skybridge, and all the others. So I think that we should be prudent because, again, there will be a shakedown. It may be brutal, it may not be. When we see how the space packs have been faring since 2021, clearly the market has understood that those anticipations were overinflated. And indeed, all those companies now are valued way below their original introduction price. So the market is understanding those things. It takes some time. So it will be consolidating and, moving along.
Taking all that into account, I know we have still people that are interested to invest in space and so on. Is it a bull or a bear market for space in the next years from your foresight?
Well, I'm not supposed to give any investment advice. My take, again, as I said, the anticipated exponential growth of space business for me doesn't stand. The only area where there would make some sense to anticipate an exponential growth because you never know. It's about tourism. So would there be a massive interest for space tourism? Personally, I have no specific interest in going to space, so probably I'm not a good candidate for that. Some people believe that this is probably the bullest market we have for space. I think that considering the energetic expense of going to space, it is not a very reasonable market for the environment of the Earth, unless we found a super clean way, of building rockets, which is not the case yet. So again, my point is that there will be consolidation. This is the time for consolidation, not for growth, clearly. And I don't see major expectations in the future. I'm not saying that a few business cases may not scale up nicely, but today I see too much anticipation. Clearly, that's the only message I want to give. There are really too many anticipation, and we see companies being created every second day. Please, guys, look around and see if this is not happening already. And do we need like 20 European proposals for autonomous software for space traffic management? I mean, I'm just quoting from the top of my mind, but we have a few as Eurospace members, and Eurospace, SpaceAble are in that business, and there are so many. And what would be the opportunities? So get the forces together, make the best each one of each other's project, but consolidate, strengthen, consolidate, provide mature solution, and then, exist before you can scale up. Exist, get revenues, get customers.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your time. It is really insightful, our conversation. We got a lot of feedback also on LinkedIn about the session already. Chris, I'm very sorry, we will not take your questions today because they will open up a complete different area of infrastructures, solar-based power and cislunar activities, which we will not open today, but promise we will cover it later. And I'll take that please as an standing invitation, Pierre, for an upcoming session here on SpaceWatch.Global in a Space Café. And with that, before we say goodbye to you in the audience and to you, a few events, that's our month of March, are ahead of us so far. Tomorrow, we have the great opportunity to run a session that I'm really honored to co-host together with Peggy Hollinger from the Financial Times, a Financial Times live event on the new space economy risk versus rewards. And we will have Carissa Christensen of Bryce Tech and Geraldine Najjar on the panel, and we will ask all the great and nasty questions to them. And I learned so much. So for me, it was a really top-level education, what I can ask tomorrow. So thanks for that, Pierre.
I will be listening. I registered myself. I will be very interested in listening.
I think we have about 1,000 registrations already. So that's massive. That's massive. So on the 8th of March, on the occasion of the International Women's Day, we have a special summit run by Emma Gatti. For you, we have Maya Klickman, we have Jennifer Manner, Jenny Tapio, Sumaya Al-Hajari, and Raji Rajagopalan on this panel on the 14th. I have the next 2 weeks, the next 33 minutes with Maya Glickman Pariente, and we will talk about the secret life of a satellite operator. Few days later, we have our next Space Café Austria, and you see here name change. We will have it by Sabine Pongruber, and we're really looking forward to that. And on the 28th, I will speak with the French embassy, a representative for space here in Berlin, with Gilles Rabin about the German-French space project. So stay tuned for that. And no, it's not just a short conversation. We will extend it a bit. So on the 29th, we have our next Black Ops, Emma Gattis, and the 30th, we will end the month with another Space Café Israel. So all these events are going to be on Eventbrite, and if we would like to hear your feedback, so please check in with us on Twitter, on Facebook, or on LinkedIn. Don't forget to sign up to our daily and bi-weekly newsletters, and if you like to treat yourself with something special, become a Space Watcher today or help us in the supporter program. Thank you very much, Pierre. for this really absolute insightful and enjoyable talk and for being our guest. And
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Welcome, anytime. Thanks again to this entire team behind the scenes for doing their great job week by week and run that smoothly. And thanks also to you in the audience for joining us. Hope to see you tomorrow or in the next weeks for our upcoming events. In the meantime, visit our website and follow us on social media. And take care, and don't forget, become a space watcher. Thank you very much.